And then turning to the Gospels, finally, I mean, we should turn to sort of all the resources that we have in historical Jesus scholarship, but I mean, that would be a huge question if I just, led with that. So if we just start with the Gospels and, maybe you tell me actually, Paul or something else is actually more useful than the Gospels for historical Jesus scholarship. Anyway, I mean, if we start with the Gospels, you mentioned in the so-called canon of the New Testament, so, what Christians recognize as scripture, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as synoptic Gospels. So, I mean, could you, in very broad terms, just introduce us to how someone interested in the question of historical Jesus goes about sort of working with the Gospels?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's different people have different approaches on this. I mean, there's been a kind of classic, I'd call it a prejudice, but a preference for the Synoptic Gospels as
Mhm.
the kind of base for a reconstruction of the history of Jesus. There are reasons for that. John's Gospel stands outside and has very different, much more reflective, symbolic manner of presenting the life of Jesus. More recent scholarship and a decision was kind of made in the 19th century in a German context to make that also a kind of fork in the road that you decide either for the synoptics and against John, or and the decision was for that. That has been revisited in the last generation as well. And John's Gospel is also, I think, today certainly by quite a few recognized as a pretty important, even invaluable source and complement to the picture that we get from the Synoptic Gospels. Um, there are different dimensions to that. One is the claim to eyewitness that's connected with John's Gospel. That's a discussion in itself, and we can pursue that if you'd like. But just to give some examples of that, I mean, there's a lot of detail that appears, topographical detail, for instance, about sites, locations that appears in John's Gospel that's not characteristic of the style of the synoptics. And it's extraordinary here again, just by the measure of archaeology or verisimilitude, which isn't a proof, but it's a kind of congruence with what we know. The city.
And verisimilitude here means, does this basically match what we know about like the culture and historical context? And
Exactly, exactly. I mean, so
okay.
back to the languages, for instance, the sign on Jesus' cross is written in three languages, even like the signs in Jerusalem today, this polyglot kind of context. Um, but for instance, it's very striking that John's Gospel is very frequently structured around the symbol of water, and that has to do with particular locations in Jerusalem of these public pools. This happens to be something that's, in the last 5 years, actually, it's pretty recent, but there's been a lot of archaeology done about the water systems in first century Jerusalem. And it has a water culture that's like absolutely unique in the Middle East and even in the Roman Empire. It has everything to do with mass pilgrim traffic. So the Jewish pilgrimage to the temple had taken on such a scope with Herod's rebuilding of the temple. I mean, there's economic dimensions of this, but infrastructure dimensions, that the city itself was being reconstructed simply to meet the water needs of all of these people. And so it's absolutely a perfect fit. It could be invented, but it's a perfect fit that Jesus is constantly going to Jerusalem on pilgrimage and showing up at these sites of water, which were designed as the kind of gathering place for the pilgrims. So there's these kinds of ways that John gives us a very vivid, but also a remarkably accurate picture. We don't have the same kinds of issues. For instance, Old Testament scholars have to fight with different issues of archaeology and accuracy. In the New Testament, it's almost embarrassingly easy sometimes of how well
Okay.
the evidence and the texts fit together.
Yeah. I mean, and the upshot of this particular point is, I mean, you can't just set aside John. So you
No,
have the Synoptic Gospels, but maybe an older style of scholarship was, well, they're written probably before John, and therefore those are the ones that actually count. But
Right.
actually, when you examine John, you find sort of more primitive material that can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many ways, I mean, we get material there that we don't get in the other texts, and so get a fuller picture and a necessary part of the picture.